Hello and welcome to the EdTech Podcast. Today I'm joined by Tom Orrell and Cameron Mirza, two incredible leaders working at the intersection of education, international development, digital policy and systems change. This is a conversation today much more than just technology. It is about education as a force of equity, the realities of the global learning crisis and the difficult choices facing governments, policymakers and education leaders as AI begins to reshape how we learn, work and govern. Tom brings a background in human rights law, digital policy and sustainable development, whilst Cameron's journey has taken him from the UK's Department for Education, leading major education programmes across the Middle East. Together they work on a programme in Jordan, focusing on early grade literacy and numeracy outcomes for young learners. In this episode, we explore AI, sovereignty, ethics, implementation, trust, and what it really takes to create meaningful change in education systems. So lock in and listen. This one's going to be a good one. Hello and welcome to the EdTech Podcast, Tom and Cameron. It's great to have you here. Would you be able to tell our international listeners a little bit about who you are, please?
Hi, thanks so much, Philippa, and lovely to be here. Cameron, good to see you again. My name is Tom Orrell. I'm a Deputy Director of Programs at Development Gateway. I live in London in the UK. My background covers human rights law, digital policy, and sustainable development and humanitarian action.
Philippa, hi, good to see you. Hi, Tom. So I'm Cameron Mirza, and my background is really just purely educational. So started in DFES, or as it was back in the early 2000s, Department for Education, and had a great time working on some really interesting programs then. And then sort of after, I think it was 2011 or 2012, I got this job offer to go and work in the Middle East. I remember it was a cold November day, and I got this phone call, and I looked at all the rain outside, and I thought, yeah, I'm going to take that job. And then so I moved out with one suitcase, never to return. And now I'm working for IREX for coming up to 6 years, running education programs in Jordan.
That is fantastic. Very interestingly, you both come from quite different backgrounds, but yet you collaborate, you know each other. Tell us a little bit about the common ground that you guys have found and how you two are connected.
Well, I can start if you like, Tom. I mean, first of all, I think we, although I am actually a Londoner. I've spent most of my life in London, and Tom is an authentic Londoner from the dark side of town that is known as Tottenham. And I think we came together through work, really, but I think it was a bit more than that. I think also for me, it's about our kind of shared vision. We have a shared vision, and I do believe shared values about how education can really transform societies and the way it can be done, you know, in terms of its ethics and equity. So I think those kind of shared values really did sort of bring us together and put us on the same page really quickly, as well as our banter, I would say as well. I think people sometimes in meetings are a bit aghast at our banter, and often have to sort of with me on the shoulders to say, what are you talking about? We don't understand a single word that you're actually talking about. I think that's my perspective, Tom.
Yeah, absolutely. No, there've been some funny moments with that, especially because we both work internationally. So having two Brits with kind of dry British humor, sometimes it lands and sometimes it doesn't quite land. But obviously, as Brits, that makes it even more humorous. No, I echo Cameron on a lot of those points. I think I come from a really diverse background as well. Yeah, London is home, but like many here, I've made it home over the years. And I think one thing that Cameron and I share is that diverse worldview that's been shaped by exposure to lots of different contexts, experiences, cultures, ways of thinking. And I think it really does shape how you view the world and how you see opportunity and approach your professional work. As Cameron mentioned, we were brought together through work, but I do think we hit it off pretty much from the out. I've always been really impressed with what a sharp manager he is. When I first went to Jordan to visit the office, I left incredulous really at the incredible effort that had gone into building up an office of 30, 40 people in several months and have it working like clockwork, delivering impact really early on. in terms of policy outcomes. So it's just really impressive. And I think we both appreciate each other's drive and willingness to work hard and, work towards actually creating tangible change.
Amazing. That's so lovely to hear. And I think it's incredible to have two people on opposite ends of the world as well, being able to kind of work and collaborate together in such a nice manner that allows that human connection to really thrive as well, which I think is really important in the way and the nature in which we all work these days. It can be really hard to kind of find that connection. I think one really interesting part of this, I feel like you've circled around a little bit, but what was the first project that you worked on together? Like, what was that project that connected you?
It's the same one that we still work on. So the Asas program, Asas means foundation in Arabic. And Cameron here is the chief of party of it, which means that he's the boss. And so he can certainly speak to it more than I. But from my perspective, I think it's one of the most interesting projects that I'm currently working on. Certainly, I'm really impressed by its scale and its of achieving concrete improvements in early grades education outcomes for young Jordanian children. I have found it to be a source of inspiration as well sometimes in, some might say, the dark times in which we live at the moment with the turmoil across the Middle East. I've always been inspired and driven to contribute to that program. But yeah, it's been that same program for the last 2-3 years.
Well, but that's what it takes, doesn't it? It's growth and development and time, and these things don't happen overnight.
Well, I think for Asas, it is really, as Tom said, about improving numeracy and literacy at early grades. We know the impact of having a high quality early grades education, what that does in terms of longer term economic development and in terms of, improved health, for example, across the society, and improved life chances in particular. And we've already, in a couple of years, really had great results, great impact through our work. We've seen measurable, quantifiable improvements in numeracy and literacy, which is something we're incredibly proud of. But when I took Asas on in the summer of 2023, for me, it was more than just the opportunities to do work which is hopefully going to transform the lives of millions of young people in Jordan. But for me, it was quite personal. My mother just passed away a couple of years ago, and she spent most of her life as a primary school teacher in Birmingham. And some of my earliest recollections of her, teaching was me supporting it, marking school books late at night, putting the old gold stars on the textbooks like they used to do back in the day. And so perhaps I've never really shared that before, but it's really a personal thing for me, that her belief was always that every child should be given the best opportunity in life. And although she's not with us anymore, I feel she is. She's looking down on the work we're doing, and hopefully she feels proud of what we're accomplishing in Jordan. So it means more to me than just a piece of work. This is really something, as Tom has already said, we're really driven to succeed for many reasons.
Yeah, that's incredible. I think that's probably one of the biggest reasons why you will have travelled on your journey into education in the first place, because of that kind of influence and that what you've seen and the journey that educators go on themselves to help to educate young people.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember, it was 2003 or 2004 when I was starting at the Department for Education. And we had, they were great times in that, Blair was Prime Minister at the time, and I was able to work on such great programs like the Youth Intervention Project. The first thing I actually worked on was young apprenticeships, bringing apprenticeships to 14-year-olds, giving them 3 days a week doing GCSE, 2 days a week with an employer. And, and I think the other thing that always stuck in my mind was working on the Respect Task Force at the time, which is a big Blair policy about giving every young person an opportunity in life, inside of school, outside of school, and reducing antisocial behaviour. And those are the things that stuck in my mind. But as I said, I remember getting that call one dreary morning, looking out the window and thinking, yeah, I'm going to go to the Middle East. And, similar to yourself, since we've come into the Middle East, I think there's been incredible opportunities in education. It moves at such pace and the scale of it. So I've been grateful to work in a few countries on significant education projects. And I think, working on Asas has been unbelievable so far, working with Tom and other people, and really, trying to drive impact is really at the core of what we're trying to do.
I was on the other end of that as a teacher who was able to offer those opportunities to students who I worked with who couldn't do mainstream education because it just wasn't fit for them. And actually that purposeful ability to say, here's an apprenticeship, skills for life, with the ability to still have some core GCSEs. That's really, it's amazing to kind of see somebody from the other side of it who put that together. Well, so I'm sure myself and lots of educators around the world would say a huge thank you because it made a massive difference to those students' lives.
It's interesting that you both have kind of those education links. I do too. I didn't know that about your mum, Cameron. My mum is also a teacher, and in fact taught me for 5 years, not in primary school, unfortunately. I feel it would have probably gone better had she taught me in primary school, but she was my history teacher throughout secondary school. And it was quite an interesting experience. I think once she actually threw a book at me across the classroom. And again, this will have been in 2003, 2004. That's a little age gap there to be aware of. But to be fair to her, and in all seriousness, I think similar to you, Cameron, and similar to you, Philippa, as a teacher, having my mum as a teacher has actually given me far more appreciation for the value of education. She worked really hard her whole life to ensure that she was well educated, to ensure that I was educated, made sacrifices to make that possible. And more than anything else, I think through her teaching taught me critical thinking. And if I had to identify the one skill which I hope makes me good at what I do, it is that critical thinking. And a lot of that comes down to how my mum taught me history. So it's interesting that we all share that link, something to reflect on.
Absolutely, because I was going to ask actually, your journey is so very different. It's so at the same core of helping and supporting people, but in a very different narrative to begin with. And although I'm aware your role doesn't necessarily just work on this project, it works on multiple projects, but this one I know that you do find deeply satisfying and incredibly interesting to work on. So what led you to where you are now from where you are? What are the kind of values that have really helped you along that journey?
Yeah, thanks, Philippa. So I'm half Palestinian. So working in the Middle East on education, I think, is incredibly important to me simply by being from that part of the world. In addition to that, and closely linked to that, I've always had a passion and an interest for international affairs. And I recall from a very young age, probably around 13, 14, having been attracted to ideas like international cooperation, peace building, and things like that. I recall the first time I read the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. I'm not entirely sure how old I was, but again, it was quite young. It will have been around 13, 14. And I just found it to be such an interesting document. I got really excited about it, about the fact that there were these standards in the world that were designed to try and uphold the rights of all people. And it's kind of gone from there, really. I set an ambition as a teenager to one day work for the United Nations. And I was very fortunate and achieved that at a very young age. At the age of 21, I had a paid contract with UNICEF in Ethiopia. And those early experiences of working in Ethiopia in particular with incredible people, incredible Ethiopians, incredible staff from all over the world, I think have been incredibly formative for me. They taught me that most of the dilemmas that we face are some form of shade of grey. They're not binary. There are very few problems in the world that are black and white, is what I'm trying to get at here. And I think that lesson very early on in my career has really shaped how I think about things. After that, I moved to the United Kingdom and studied law and tried to become a barrister here, a practicing barrister. I got partway there. I completed my barristerial studies, as it were, at university, but I never completed the pupillage vocational stage. But I did spend 4 to 5 years working for a legal aid firm representing homeless families, prisoners, immigrants and refugees, and advocating quite literally for their rights to be respected by the state. After that failed attempt to establish a legal career, if I put it that way, I then turned back to development work and got pulled into a couple of projects that related to the protection of human rights in cyberspace and online at the day. So questions that are still live in the world today around the right to freedom of expression online, the right to privacy online, and the like. And one thing led to another, and I came full circle back to the development world, as it were, in terms of working with governments and other stakeholders to improve socioeconomic conditions. And after several years of running my own consulting company, I joined Development Gateway a couple of years ago and have been very happy there, working with Cameron on this program and several others.
That's such an incredible story. And I again go back to the fact they're both so rooted in wanting prosperity and wanting equity for everybody in the world. It feels so values driven at the core of what both of you are doing in quite separate ways, but also combined together. And I think that is really powerful. I think when you look at the education space right now, I think one of the things when you were talking there came into my head was, it's one of the global goals, equity and education for all. How far along do you see that being? Are we in an innovation landscape right now? Are we seeing progress being made from your opinion? And what are those big issues that are being talked about right now?
It's really tough out there, actually, Philippa. If we think about, the World Bank frame it as we're in a global learning crisis right now. I think if you look at some of the kind of key data points, I think it was UNESCO say we require 44 million additional teachers by the end of this decade. And if you look at the data coming out of UK, which was fairly recent, 50% of teachers plan to leave the profession in the next 5 years, which is really damning, isn't it? And then on top of that, we've got children going to school hungry. We've got we're in the middle of a kind of cost of living crisis, which is putting incredible strains on families around the world, particularly right now, obviously with the kind of challenges in the Middle East as well, inflation and everything else. It's really tough for people, and I feel really kind of sad, really, when I think about these challenges we face. And we also think about, imagine this, in the US, student debt right now is estimated at $1.8 trillion student debt. And on top of that, right. So the average student has a debt of $40,000, and they're going into an incredibly fragile labor market. So when you think about the kind of system that we're facing in education right now, it's really challenging. Countries' resources are being stretched. More money is being spent on defence than ever before. So whilst it paints a slightly pessimistic picture, I do think that there are great opportunities in amongst all of that, and I think it's really important that organisations working particularly within education do really focus, I think, on building capability, not just quickly, but the depth of capability required to navigate these complexities and challenges. What we're seeing now is system level challenges. I think previously a lot of challenges were more local, but I think when we look at it now, they are system level challenges like never before. And it requires a different way of thinking.
Yeah,
absolutely. Cameron summarized it pretty well, I think. The short version is we face a range of difficult choices fundamentally. And this is where technology and innovation do come in. And again, referring back to what I said earlier about there being no black and white in the world, just a spectrum of good and bad and opportunity and challenge. My view is that we don't really have a choice but to embrace technology one way or another. And if that's the starting point, it should be made with a critical lens from the outset and framed that way, that it's not about being, part of this tech solutionist hype driving, mania, but it's about being pragmatic and recognizing that there are extremely substantive changes taking place very rapidly in the technology space that are transformative. They may not be as transformative as some people believe they will be, but regardless, they will be transformative one way or another. The way I like to think about it is if we think about the wave of transformation that happened when everybody started using computers in white-collar jobs, or the wave in transformation that happened when everybody started connecting to the internet and using emails and messaging services, etc. I believe we're on the cusp of a similar type of transformation where AI will permeate how we work. It doesn't mean it's going to transform human nature. It doesn't mean it's going to solve all of humanity's problems, but it does mean that there will be new ways of doing things. And I think we need to recognize that in that context, AI will play an acceleration function. It will accelerate change. What people need to be mindful of is that it can accelerate change in any direction. There's no guarantee that the change that AI will accelerate will be positive. It accelerates extremely harmful change in some instances. One just needs to think about the rise in tech-facilitated gender-based violence, TFGBV, all of these horrendous stories about the generation of child sexual abuse images, etc. to recognize that there is the potential for great harm. But equally, there's the potential for great opportunity and great experimentation. And for me, the key here is merging new technology with the age-old philosophical question of, well, I say philosophical question, probably rather political question of what is the function of education primarily? Is it to churn out professionals to meet job market requirements, or is it to develop well-rounded individuals? And I think if you start to appraise education systems through that binary, that can actually help to sort the kinds of choices that you make and leverage AI in a way that recognizes critically that it could be positive or negative, and also recognizes that if you leverage it in the right way, it can augment the types of skills that you would like to see rather than replace human capabilities.
I think that's so vital, that human capability side. And actually, it's what we're seeing coming out in so many of the global reports is human in the loop, making sure that we've got those humanistic skills, because so much of automation is going to take hold of things that we just do not need to be doing anymore. And those critical thinking skills that you've mentioned and actually being able to be present and human and have connection is going to be so much more vital. But we have to teach people to have to do that. Actually, we're seeing babies not be able to make eye contact with their parents because people are on mobile phones so often. And actually, there are so many gaps generationally around the use of technology. And actually, before we kind of go deeper into AI, I think one of my questions would be, and I guess it's tricky to frame, when you've mentioned technology came in and people started to get the internet or the World Wide Web, and we started to bring into white collar jobs technology, and then we brought it into education. Fundamentally, there were scaffolds and policies that really should, in hindsight, have been brought in. Do you think governments are aware, or policymakers are aware and have reflected enough upon the things that could and should have been done to protect people from technology, that one could have potentially mitigated what's happening now, but actually to be able to set the framework and foundations for what is now happening at government levels with AI strategies? Because if we're not able to recognize where safeguards and procedures could have helped to govern and to have governance, are we going to be able to do that now, even with AI?
Great. It's a great question, Philippa. I mean, I think, look, policymakers tend to rely a lot on evidence and research to frame policy. I think what we're seeing is the technology moving so quickly that they're unable to capture that evidence base, right, to really formulate policy. And in fact, if you look at, and we talk a lot about AI, there is really a lack of gold standard research around AI right now. It is about or technology, absolutely. I think it's policy making on the hoof, isn't it? At the moment, is what we're seeing, and we're seeing challenges, different challenges around the world. And we talk about, Tom mentioned about widening inequalities, and I think that's absolutely right. I think there is fundamentally an over-reliance on AI as a fast answer to system problems. And a lot of the inequalities or amplification of inequalities are based around data, infrastructure, governance, language. So fascinating thing I read the other day was that 40% of ChatGPT's web traffic comes from middle income countries. I mean, India alone, incredibly, has 100 million weekly active users. But then on the other side of the coin, infrastructure tells the opposite story completely. So high income countries host 77% of global data center capacity, and low income countries host less than 0.1%. And 87% of AI models come from countries containing 17% of the world's population. The gap is widening, not closing. It's huge, isn't it?
Yeah.
The gap's getting wider and wider. And so if you frame it in terms of that, how on earth can policymakers get a grip on this?
Go one step further. I think it's, there's those challenges, Cameron, which rely on, on having evidence and being able to recognize and understand the implications of actions, through the lens of analyzing and assessing evidence. The other side to this, in my view, is the political side. And here I think we need to draw a distinction between policymakers and politicians, and political decisions and political choices. Because sitting above all of the tough choices that kind of policymakers have at that bureaucratic level when they're thinking about hard policy and policy changes is the fact that we live in a world where digital policy is highly geopoliticized, and we have a fragmented global narrative when it comes to the application of disruptive technologies. I think this is pretty harmful, actually. The fact that we have different power blocks and economic blocks around the world pursuing very divergent objectives when it comes to their rollout and promotion of artificial intelligence solutions. It's an area where there was an evolving consensus, not to say that there weren't serious disagreements, and there were different power blocks already, but I think in the last 2-3 years we've certainly seen an acceleration in the fragmentation of political consensus around the value of AI. So my concern, actually, to go back to your initial question, is that we've actually regressed from where we were a few years ago. And that worries me, because what we're seeing is the accumulation of power in the hands of a few companies and a few states. And that will not help in the cause of democratizing and generating access to technologies that work in different contexts around the world, in different educational contexts, in different cultural contexts, in different linguistic contexts. I think there's a danger that we're pursuing models of innovation which have a tendency of augmenting the harmful impacts of digital technology rather than enabling them to become useful tools for education. It's a very complicated landscape with challenges at different levels. And on the face of it, it seems that a lot of things are stacked against people like Cameron and I who are trying to generate real change. But I don't think it's all that bleak. I think there are spots of light.
And I think that is the thing that all of us educators or people in education hold on to, isn't it? Is those spots of light. I think what would be interesting to know is, of these risks and things and distraction, what are the parts that are making things worse? And I think you've touched upon them a little bit there. But if we think about, for instance, there's so many systems work in silos, which is tricky in itself. But actually, on the same lens, if you then bring that all together and try and bring education into a system that is very different to it under other government entities and things, that can also pose a problem, which I think some people are trying to do. Where do you sort of see some of these real issues that are kind of making things worse or harder?
I think, Philippa, from an education perspective, I think the missing piece is often the operating model that brings all these pieces together. And I think that the countries that will win the next phase of what we could describe as global innovation will not really be the ones with the best funds, the most money, for example. I think it will be countries that build the best innovation governance systems. I think it will be the countries that can safely test new technologies, align regulators, bring the private sector and investor closer to validate opportunities and to create clear pathways from experimentation to deployment, which is some of the work me and Tom are doing right now with sandboxes in Jordan. And I think trying to look ahead over the next decade, I think the next decade will really belong to those countries that understand that innovation is no longer just about technology, it is about coordination. And I think that the countries who are agile, who can connect government regulators, capital, infrastructure, entrepreneurs, policymakers into one trusted system, and you could almost describe that as a kind of sovereign innovation corridor, really, I think will be the winners in all of this.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that reflection has happened through the work me and Tom are doing at the moment, actually.
I'd written down sovereignty because it is such a key driver right now, isn't it, as well?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more with Cameron, actually, on this one. I think that's exactly right. It's about that holistic approach. And to build a little bit on what Cameron was describing there, the work that we're doing in Jordan is exactly that, really. It's working in very close alignment and partnership with the educational authorities in the country and with universities in the country to really understand what it is that they want to achieve, and then working to measure and determine the degree to which their systems are currently stand, are capable of absorbing this disruptive change. What we're hoping to do beyond that, as Cameron said, is then test out solutions with them through a sandboxing exercise that my colleague Fernando Ferreira has developed at DG, and really work with them so that they understand the opportunities and the trade-offs of the choices that they may have to make. The reason that we ended up with this paradigm and this approach towards the work that we're doing is because I think Cameron and I were quite quick to identify when we started to think about this, the fact that the market is already flooded. It's almost as if there's too much choice out there. And one of the largest stumbling blocks that policymakers face and that systems generally face and countries face is understanding how to navigate that complex landscape of rapidly evolving innovation to select the tools and the approaches and the governance frameworks that would work best for them. The short version of this is basically learning to cut out the noise and just focus on what is important and what is critical based on their national priorities. And this is where it comes back to that sovereignty point, Philippa, because what we're seeing as part of the geopolitical fragmentation that I mentioned earlier is this real focus on the importance of sovereign systems. And when I say that, what I mean is, it's no longer just about keeping the data within a country's borders. It's about, do we have computing power in our borders? Do we have AI models which have been trained on data sets that relate to and apply to the context that we're working in? Do these tools developed in California actually work in the languages that we use locally? The sovereignty question has become relevant across the whole stack. If I can put it that way.
Totally agree. It's really interesting. I was talking to some people from the Turks and Caicos, and they were saying that every time they build and develop something or have internal capacity developed, they disappear off to other places. And so they're now building capacity internally with local people and investing within those people who have invested themselves within their life being that location. And that's a human sort of focus of it. But actually, this is so valuable. A lot of the work within the Middle East as well is doing exactly that. We are not that country. What does it mean to us, and where do we need to go? And I think that's really valuable sense of belonging as well, because we know from research when we feel we belong, we get more from it. We feel like it's going to actually benefit and actually have a potential within that vision. It links, it makes sense, and people can sit with that, which when technology is involved as well is important, because that can be quite a scary part of the process, is actually embedding that technology in that process and that management of change. So lots of this has been discussed around things that you're doing in the process, and the sandboxes are going to be vital, clearly, especially within that reflective piece. But how have your previous experiences potentially helped you learn and shape around the people that you're working with, the systems, the culture, the implementation of that? What have previously kind of things that, you Tom mentioned failure earlier within a role, but actually I do always find that is the ability to kind of reflect upon that is us saying, okay, how do I do it better next time? So what's helped you on your journeys?
I think personally, failure is actually really key. So, I was heartbroken when my legal career didn't turn out the way that I'd hoped. I'd invested so much time, money, effort, energy into it, years of my life. But I think, well, for a start, a legal education can only ever give you a solid foundation, regardless of what you end up doing. It's not wasted time. So I was able to leverage that and I think pick myself up. And I think what that experience teaches you is that it's okay to take risks, and it's okay if they don't always work out. I don't think I'd ever have started a company, for example, had I not experienced that failure in pursuit of a legal career. I don't think I'd have had the right mindset and right risk appetite. So I think it's certainly given me a higher tolerance for risk, and that's been incredibly useful in programs like ASAS, where Cameron and I, have been working together to come up with literally new offerings for our respective organizations, new packages of services, and to put our reputations on the line a little bit in saying this will work, and we are ready to implement this with partners. We have confidence in what we're proposing here, and we believe that even though this may be the first time that we're doing some of this work, it will genuinely result in positive change.
Amazing. Cameron?
I think the change is a really interesting topic, because it if I think about change when I worked in the UK, it was very much done from a people-centered approach. Hearts, minds, hands was kind of like the mantra. It's very, very co-design, co-develop, and change was driven by having very strong policies based on research and evidence. Then moving to the Middle East, it was almost the opposite. It was top down, everything's top down, and no evidence, no research, no feedback loops, and it was the complete opposite. And I think what I've learned over the years is actually change has really the culture of change is so important where you are in the world, right? There is no one way of driving cultural change or behavior change. So I think it's a deep understanding of the culture where you are working. That's really important. The other part of this, I think, is establishing trust is so important. And the other part to this is sequencing. So if you're trying to drive change, what I've often noticed is that people or countries trying to do too much at the same time. And the big problem is the implementation gap. I think there's great vision, there's great ideas, but it tends to fall apart when the implementation hits the road. And so through the work that we've been doing over the last few years, I really think that actually we put a lot of deep thinking into how to implement, to how to structure implementation, not to overburden the system, to give people time and space to implement successfully, and build in that data collection, the ability to adapt. As Tom said, that kind of mindset that actually failing forward is good. You learn from it. I really believe in failing forward, but I also think building resilience within systems to drive change. And I think one of the things we really focus on is building organizational memory. I think we've all worked in organizations where one or two people leave and everything collapses. Really. So we spend a lot of time on that and embracing technology where we can to solve problems rather than just putting in technology for the sake of it. So I think the lens that I look at change now is quite different to how I used to look at it 15, 20 years ago. But I think if I was to sort of summarize it, it's really about trust. It's about culture, trust, and sequencing.
Yeah, incredible. And I guess to bring it to kind of my final question for you both is that, looking to the future, what does that mean that, leaders need to be doing more of? How can they kind of iterate themselves, build into this future, think about their next processes? So what would you say to leaders?
I think leadership is really tough right now. I would say that for me, leaders need to demonstrate a systems mindset. They need to think ethically, and I think they need to think entrepreneurially as well, doing better with less resources. They've got to be able to learn fast, act responsibly. I think, but keep the human element at the core. I think, going back to what we talked about right at the start, I think keeping that human element is going to be critical. But I think leaders need to think better. And what do I mean by that? I think they need to be close to the ground. I think too often people making decisions, driving organizations, driving programs are too removed from reality on the ground. That need to be closer to the ground. They've got to be able to work increasingly in ambiguity. There's so much grey out there right now, and how do you navigate that? But I think you've got to be able to generally think through that and see it as an opportunity. But I think it's really also about focusing on what matters. And it's that, I think we mentioned it earlier, noise, but I think it's getting that signal to noise ratio just right? Blocking out the noise and really focusing on what are the things that are really going to drive change. And I think that, because we live in a world of short-termism, how can you think long-term if you're driven by short-termism, short-term results, short-term impact? I think that's very hard to manage. And I think, but leaders will need to be able to get that balance in thinking medium to long term, but still able to manage the short-termism that we live in today.
Absolutely. I agree with everything Cameron said there, actually. I think it's really hard. The only things I would add perhaps are, I think in an era where technology is going to play, and already does play, such a prominent role in the way in which we work, I would absolutely emphasize and re-emphasize the human connection point. I think emotional intelligence, being able to communicate to other people, being able to think laterally, and being able to lead with empathy and embed empathy in how you operate are going to be the crucial skills that differentiate successful companies, organizations, education institutions from those which are not. One of the big challenges that we see at the moment is polarization in so many different ways, and the exacerbation of inequities and inequalities in many different ways and aspects of our lives. So I do think that focusing on that human connection is absolutely vital and key here. This is starting to emerge in the literature. It's been talked about a lot in the recent past, in the last 1 or 2 years. There's loads of articles about leadership and being kind and being empathetic and all of this. But I think it is being driven by a genuine recognition that there is a deficit of that at the moment.
Yeah, definitely. I think this has been an incredibly thought-provoking conversation. It's been really wonderful to speak to you both about your careers and how you've got here, but also the potential in the future of what's going to be happening within different regions. And just I hope that, we can start to use that thoughts, those different things that we've learned, those lessons and all those vital skills to be able to bring a brighter future that is slightly more positive than potentially what we might read and hear in silos of information that whirls around our heads so frequently. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for being on the EdTech podcast today, Tom and Cameron.
Thank you, Philippa.
Thank you so much for having us, Philippa. And a big shout out to Aston Villa for their recent victory. The future does look bright. There you go, Cameron.
Thanks
you.
for that. Thanks, Tom.
What a fantastic conversation. And what I really enjoyed with Tom and Cameron is that it brought us back to something very human. Yes, we talked about AI, data, infrastructure, policy, and sovereignty, as well as innovation. But underneath all of that was a much bigger question. How do we make sure education systems genuinely serve people, communities, and future generations? Tom reminded us that technology will accelerate change, but not always in the right direction unless we approach it critically and ethically. And Cameron brought us back to the importance of culture, trust, and sequencing, because vision alone is never enough if implementation fails on the ground. For education leaders, the message is so clear. We need to think systemically, act responsibly, and stay close to reality and keep the human element at the centre at all times. A huge thank you to Tom and Cameron for such a thoughtful and honest conversation. You can really feel the connection between the two of them, and the work that they're doing is really powerful across the Middle East and further. You've been listening today to the EdTech Podcast. I've been your host, Philippa Wraithmell. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you next time. If you enjoyed today's show, please share with other people, send a like, or even just reshare on our socials so that we can get more people listening to these amazing conversations.